In 1978, a young man named Yigal Amir was not yet known to the world. He was just an ordinary student living in Israel, but years later his name would become connected to one of the most shocking revenge-driven acts in modern history. However, this story is not about his actions. It is about the man who became the target of a decades-long conflict, the people affected by it, and how one decision changed an entire nation. Years before the event that shocked the world, political and social tensions in Israel were growing rapidly. Different groups had completely opposite visions for the future of the country, and disagreements that once stayed within political debates began creating deep divisions among ordinary citizens. At the center of this conflict was Yitzhak Rabin, a former military leader who became Prime Minister of Israel. Rabin believed that peace negotiations were necessary and worked toward agreements with Palestinian leaders. For many people, his efforts represented hope. For others, they represented betrayal. One group believed Rabin was giving away too much. They saw his decisions as a threat to their future and began organizing against him. The anger grew stronger, and some extremists began calling his actions unforgivable. Then came the night of November 4th, 1995. Thousands of people gathered in Tel Aviv for a peace rally. The atmosphere was emotional but hopeful. People sang songs, held signs, and supported the idea of ending years of conflict. At the end of the event, Rabin walked toward his vehicle. Among the crowd was a man who had been planning his attack for months. Yigal Amir approached and fired 3 shots. Within seconds, one of Israel's most important political figures was critically injured. The news spread across the world. A nation that had already been divided suddenly faced a moment of shock and grief. But the deeper story was not only about the assassination. It was about how dangerous revenge and hatred can become when people convince themselves that violence is justified. The attacker believed he was carrying out revenge for what he considered a betrayal. But instead of changing history in the way he imagined, his actions created the opposite effect. The assassination caused widespread mourning, increased security concerns, and forced people to confront the dangers of political extremism. The revenge he believed would protect his cause became the event that damaged it forever. Years later, the case continued to be studied by historians and researchers because it showed how one person's desire for revenge could affect millions of lives. The lesson from the story was not about victory or defeat. It was about how anger, when allowed to grow unchecked, can transform into something that changes history forever. Years passed after the incident that changed his life forever, but the pain never truly disappeared. While everyone around him continued moving forward, he remained trapped in the memory of what happened and the people responsible for destroying everything he had built. Many expected him to simply accept what happened and leave the past behind, but he believed that forgetting was impossible without justice. During those years, he completely changed his life. He became quieter, more patient, and more focused. The anger that once controlled him slowly transformed into determination. He understood that acting emotionally would only ruin his chances, so instead of making reckless decisions, he spent years collecting information, studying every detail, and waiting for the right moment. The people who had caused his suffering believed they had escaped forever. They continued living their lives, building families, finding jobs, and convincing themselves that the past would never return. They thought time had erased their actions. But they were wrong, because while they forgot, he remembered everything. He tracked every small piece of information that could connect him back to the people involved. Old documents, forgotten records, conversations with people who knew what happened, and details that others ignored slowly became part of a much bigger picture. What started as a personal mission became a carefully planned search for accountability. The hardest part was waiting. There were moments when he wanted to act immediately, moments when anger returned and made him question whether patience was worth it. But he knew one mistake could destroy everything. If he moved too quickly, the people responsible could disappear again. So he waited, and while he waited, the world around him changed. Technology improved. Communication became easier. Information that was once impossible to find became accessible. The same tools that helped people hide their past eventually became the tools that exposed it. Slowly, he began finding the answers he had been searching for. One by one, connections started appearing. Names that once seemed impossible to reach became visible. Places that once felt distant became accessible. The people who thought they were protected by time began realizing that the past they buried was coming back. When the first confrontation finally happened, it was not the dramatic moment everyone expected. There was no shouting, no chaos, no emotional explosion. Instead, there was silence. Because after decades of carrying anger, he finally stood face to face with the people who had changed his life forever. And in that moment, he realized something important. The years of pain had not disappeared, but he was no longer the same person who had lost everything. The person standing there was someone who had survived, adapted, and refused to let the past completely destroy him. The case eventually gained attention because it showed something unusual about revenge. Many people imagine revenge as a single moment of anger, but in reality, the strongest revenge stories are often about endurance, patience, and refusing to give up. The people responsible believed they had won because they escaped consequences for years. But time was not protecting them. Time was simply giving him the opportunity to find them. The final outcome changed how people viewed the case. Some saw it as justice finally arriving after years of waiting. Others questioned whether anyone should spend so much of their life chasing revenge. But one thing was clear: the past had finally caught up with everyone involved. For years, the people who caused the suffering lived without fear, believing nobody would ever challenge them again. They believed the distance of time had separated them from their actions. But they learned the hardest lesson. Time does not always erase the truth. Sometimes it only hides it until someone is ready to uncover it. And after decades of waiting, the person they thought they had forgotten became the person they could no longer escape. But even after the truth finally started coming out, the journey was far from easy. The years of waiting had changed him in ways nobody around him could fully understand. People saw the result, but they did not see the years of frustration, the sleepless nights, and the moments when giving up seemed like the easier choice. There were times when he questioned whether finding the people responsible would actually bring him peace. Because revenge has a strange effect on people. It gives them a goal when they feel powerless, but when that goal finally gets closer, they're forced to ask whether the outcome will truly heal the damage that was done. For him, the answer was complicated. He did not forget what happened. He did not forgive easily. But he also realized that the biggest victory was not watching others suffer. The biggest victory was proving that they had failed to destroy him. The people who once believed they had complete control over his life no longer had that power. Their actions had created years of pain, but they had also created someone who refused to disappear. When the final pieces of the story became public, many people were shocked by how long the truth had remained hidden. It became a reminder that unresolved actions do not simply vanish because time passes. Sometimes they remain buried, waiting for someone willing to search for them. The story spread because it connected with something deeply human. Everyone understands the feeling of being wronged. Everyone understands a desire to see justice happen. But what made this case different was the incredible patience behind it. Most people want immediate answers. They want immediate consequences. But this story showed that sometimes the strongest response is not a sudden reaction. It is persistence. Years later, when people look back at everything that happened, they realized the revenge was never just about one final moment. The real revenge was the fact that the people who caused the damage eventually had to face what they had tried to escape. They had spent years believing they were untouchable, until one person proved they were not. And in the end, the greatest lesson from the story was simple. People may hide from the truth for a while, they may run from consequences, and they may believe time has erased their actions, but eventually every secret has a way of finding its way back. Because sometimes revenge is not about destroying someone. Sometimes revenge is simply making sure the world finally knows what they did. In the end, the story was not only about revenge, but about patience, survival, and the power of never giving up. The people who believed they had escaped forever eventually had to face the consequences of their actions. After years of waiting, searching, and fighting against the past, the truth finally came to light. He proved that time does not always erase what happened, and that hidden actions can eventually return when someone refuses to forget. His journey showed that the strongest revenge is not always about causing pain, but about standing strong, exposing the truth, and making sure justice finally arrives. Because no matter how far someone runs from their past, the truth always finds a way back.